I tracked her activities since the early 80s, perhaps even just a little before that time period. If I could clone myself, she would be one of my clones, one of my alter egos because of her life track. She majored in biology. She got her Bachelor of Science from the University of Florida and her Master's from Florida Institute of Technology. Diane is a student, a teacher. She's an environmental planner at the beginning of the start of that environmental planning field and the whole ecology movement and the awareness of the we are one with the earth kind of thing. It isn't just for surfers. She's a mother raising children in Brevard County, an environmentalist. She was a professional planner, a community leader, historian, and a historic homeowner, as maybe all of you know, living on Riverview Drive in Melbourne. It's in many of these capacities that she encountered history along the way, as well as her own personal interest in history. Among her credits are, I call her, when I talk about Diane, now this is my chance, she's not going to say how a terrible person she is. She's always saying, but I wasn't perfect. But among her achievements are, I call her the mother of the Marine Resources Council of East Florida and Turkey Creek Sanctuary, as well as I think she's probably a very memorable educator to many of her students. I wish I had been one of her students. So before we begin your presentation, I want to thank you for your contributions to the Brevard community in so many areas. I'm so glad. But I think all of our lives are so much richer when you think about those two major events. Our lives are so much richer because of Diane's being here. So I'm so pleased to present my clone, Diane Braile.
Now you want me to talk. The thing is that when you're old, there's a lot of things you've done, you know, it adds up. And so it sounds like a lot, but, you know, when it's over time, it's not. So I was trying to figure out what to call this, because, you know, people have been coming here for a long time. So I thought maybe I'd call it, Y'all Come to America's Lagoon. That didn't sound too good. Then I thought, well, how about come down to the lands. Come on down here. The land's practically free. The fish are jumping. And the orange trees are high. That's the song. The fish are jumping. It's accordion bass. Or how about welcome to the tropical land of opportunity, where a man of industry and fortitude can in no time be wealthy, get rich quick. Let's start at the very beginning. It's a good place to start. I'm going to talk about the geological setting of this place, prehistory, the colonial period, the American invasion. You have to understand that we invaded this territory. And then the American heyday, and where are we now? I think maybe we could call it the land of limits. So I have to go down to go up. 120,000 years ago, this area was underwater, and the beach was over on the central ridge of the state of Florida. We were underwater. And then it was warm temperatures. And then as it got colder and colder, the water got held in glaciers. So the sea level here went out 30 miles. So the beach was 30 miles from here. And this was a temperate area, very dry. There were already people moving here, but the natural resources were very slim. And there were only a couple of places in Florida there was enough water to sustain a group of people together. And one of those is the Windover site, where there have been some excavations not too long ago. About 6,000 years ago, the water level, and I hate the word sea level because everybody gets, you know, the hair on the back of their neck stands up, but it is no secret that sea level is rising. it has been rising for 10,000 years. That's not new. So by about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, sea level rose and the Indian River Lagoon was flooded. It had been an old reef, on one of the other passages of sea level, with the dunes behind it. So if you go down Melbourne Avenue and go up and down, those are old dunes, old sea dunes. And wherever you see sand pines, you know, that white sugary sand with the sand pines on top, that was another dune. So by the time that gets filled up, now we have more habitats and greater diversity of plants and animals. So those people living at Wendover had, you know, first when they came here, they were chasing mastodons. Can you believe that there was Emma? Did you know there was a mastodon here? And that the people around here that lived here went out there and they chased them. And you know where they chased them? They shot them way out on the St. John's, and it was all dry land. But there was some water at Turkey Creek. So that mastodon ran down there to get away from those people with the spears, and he died. And the people then chopped up the mastodon and took it home for supper. And the bones of that mastodon are still around here. If you keep your eyes open, you never know what you're going to see. So as those animals died out because there was no food, the people at Wendover then had to eat small animals. They were eating turtles, they were eating snakes, everything small, because that's all that would grow here. But as that sea level rose, now there were fish. So we found, when they did some excavations at NASA, they found a fish camp where they would come from Wendover to the fish camp, get fish, dry them, and take them back. So by about 3,000 years ago, there was more movement to the marine habitat. And because there were more fish, there were more clams, there were more oysters, there was more to eat. And by 800 BC, AD, after the current period, now we have chiefdoms. There was a well-organized group of people. Let's see. You know, this is what it looked like. What habitats did we have? What did it look like here? We had the hammocks, and along the Indian River and so forth, it's low land, black muck, lots of diversity. See all the different kinds of trees and birds and everything. I mean, the birds even got a snake. Then we had the sand pine areas, those old dunes with the sand pines on it and very little underneath it, and some areas of sloughs, open spaces that were wet half the year, dry half the year. And then the St. John's Marsh, the marsh itself would be wet all year, and then the prairie surrounded it, which came almost to Babcock Street, was wet part of the year. So this is what these people were dealing with. Here they are. Oh, go back. Oh, well, we'll try it this way. There they are. There was a tribe of Indians that lived only on the Indian River. They had no agriculture, they didn't grow anything, and they were vicious people. They really protected their area. These are not the ice Indians. These are the only pictures we have of Indians anywhere near here, and these are Tumulcans from New Smyrna Beach north. These pictures were drawn by Lemoyne, who came in 1530, I think I've got it down there. The French came, and they happened to be Huguenots, and they formed a fort called Fort Caroline. The Spanish heard about them leaving, and they came back and got rid of them. I won't describe how. So the Spanish start coming, and this is their view of Florida. And it's really interesting because if you look, Canaveral is always there. And one of the reasons is, you know, look at Cuba. I mean, they went there a lot, I guess. But the Platte fleet would meet here, so all of the porcelain and so forth from China, was the spices from China would come across the Panama Canal, the gold from Colombia, Peru, wherever, Brazil, all came here, and then they would go back to Spain. Now, early on, they could only go in one direction. They could only go like this, because the ships couldn't maintain themselves against the current, the Gulf Stream. So, at here is where they would start back. And there was a freshwater spring here, and they would fill up their casks of fresh water in the middle of the ocean on the way back. Now you can see that the Spanish sent a lot of people here. Maybe I'll put this over here. So you see there's Menendez, the one that's going with, oh yeah, you can do this. Here goes Ponce de Leon. He gets killed here, or wounded and then dies. Here's De Soto, he's going this way. Here's the French who came into, well actually Jacksonville, St. John's River. And then here's the oldest city. But you can see that this is always here, and they really do see the Indian River Lagoon. So the Indians here now are marine-oriented. They resist any kind of change, and the Spanish would send diplomats from St. Augustine down to this area, to the ice, to negotiate. Number one, if the Platte fleet's going by here and they happen to crash like 1517, the Spanish would come down and try to get their stuff back. Or if someone was shipwrecked here, the Spanish would come down and try to rescue them. If you've never read the book Jonathan Dickinson's Journal, it's the story of a Quaker family who were shipwrecked here and lived with the ice for several months and then walked with a 6-month-old baby to St. Augustine. And that's the only description we have of the Ice Indians, is what Jonathan Dickinson wrote. The Spanish records don't tell much about them other than that they, the governor of St. Augustine told Nexia, who was a mapper and a diplomat, not to get out of the boat when he was talking to the ice. That means you row up and you talk to them, but don't set foot on the ground because things could get bad. You got to be able to, have your guys row away pretty quickly. But there were villages of 2,000 people in this tribe. Very few on the north part, because it's twice as wide here. It's about 7 miles across, and if you're in a canoe and the wind comes up, you're in trouble. So most of the villages were here, and there was one on the Ogallie River, there was one at Palm Bay, all the way along the river there were various villages, and they would move seasonally from the beachside in because of the weather and the mosquitoes. They left big mounds of shells. And I'll tell you what happened to those. You used to be able to see them. Now, the Spanish and the English got into some battles. Oops. And so the English took over. During the American Revolution, this was England. And so these are kind of the people who were there. One of there were big plantations, so the government in England would give patents to groups of investors. And that quote about, come to the Indian River and be wealthy was from that time. So you had big plantation owners. One of them was named Turnbull. If you've ever heard of Turnbull Hammock or you've been to New Smyrna. He had a wife who was from Smyrna, so he named the place New Smyrna, and then he wanted people who could work here who were accustomed to the weather. So he went into the Mediterranean and picked up a bunch of Italians, Greeks, and Mallorcans, and brought them here as slaves. Well, what he didn't know is that these were pretty independently minded people, and they were not into slavery. And so some of them walked off one day, and then he hung a couple of them, and then the rest of them all marched to St. Augustine. But they were still here when the British. If you want to know who lived in St. Augustine, the descendants of the Menorcans didn't have enough money ever to leave. And they're still there. In fact, you know, we have Ponce Inlet. It was not named for Ponce de Leon. It was named for one of the Menorcans whose name was Pons, P-O-N-S. And so it was Ponce Inlet because after when the British came, he had his plantation there by the inlet. So it was Ponce Inlet, but somehow it got translated to Ponce Inlet. But here's who was living around here then. These are the Menorcans, 1, 2. This is one of the English tradespeople. There's a Seminole warrior. This is the East Coast Rangers. So these were local guys who knew the backwoods and so forth. And this is the regiment, the foot regiment of the British Army. So they were there for 20 years. During the Revolutionary War, there were a lot of people who came down. If you were a Tory in Georgia or South Carolina, it was not very safe for you to stick around very long, and so this area became crowded with Americans. Now, you have to understand that the Indians that were here were Spanish Indians. We keep talking about American Indians. These were Spanish Indians, and they were loyal to the British during the Revolutionary War, which is one reason when the Americans came, they weren't happy with these Indians. So they were only here 20 years. There were 2 different treaties of Paris, one in 1763 and one in 1793. And so what happened then is that went back to Spain. Now, the problem was that this was pretty far from Spain. They just lost wars, and the Americans are pushing down. In fact, when the Spanish left the first time, they took the last remaining Ice Indians with them. The descriptions of them are heartbreaking. So it was free land. There was nothing, no one here. No one here. And so we had tourist Indians. So the Creek Indians were getting pushed out in Georgia and South Carolina by the Americans. And so we had branches of the Creek Indians that moved down here. So when you see a Seminole and they say, I've been here for thousands of years, it's not. They were here from, you know, the mid-1700s. So we go back, and now it's Spanish territory, but they can't hold it. And try to get people here, the British government offered land grants to Americans or anyone that they could give land to get them to move here. And they're still on the maps, 2 of them you can see today. One is the Delaspine grant up by the power plants north of Cocoa, and the other is the Fleming grant. So if you've seen Fleming Grant Road in Mico, that's one side of the Fleming land grant. Fleming, the original Fleming was a Swiss man married to one of the Spanish families in St. Augustine, whose son later became the governor of Florida. So Florida becomes a territory of the United States. Now, like I said, the Indians and the English, or the Americans, were not getting along real well. In 1769, the Indians had agreed to stay off of the coast and stay only on the St. Johns River. But we had an American who invaded Florida. You know who? Andrew Jackson. You know, in, what is it, 1815, he took a little trip down to New Orleans, right, the Battle of New Orleans. So Jackson beats the English, and now he's going to come and get rid of the Indians in Florida. So he invades while it's still Spain. And so there, in 1821, this becomes part of the United States. It's a territory of the United States. Becomes a state in 1842. But In 1835 to 34 was one of the Seminole Wars. Usually most of that action took place north of here. But we had one notoriety here, and that was about 1855. There was something called the Armed Occupation Colony. So after the Second Seminole War, no, that's after that. After 1842, there was something called the Armed Occupational Colony. So if you were a man over 18 and you could defend yourself and your land, you could have 160 acres. So anybody with sons moved down here, and there were 40 families from the Sebastian River all the way down south of St. Lucie County. And they all wanted these large parcels of land. The interesting thing is that who did they have with them? They had a revenue agent. Why would you need a revenue agent in the middle of nowhere where nothing grows? They wanted trees. One of the reasons that Florida became a state is because they needed live oak. They needed trees. Why? Ships. Because the live oak is the strongest material that you can use in shipbuilding. And so there were groups called live oakers that came from like Connecticut and wherever boat building was done. And they would have specific dimensions for live oak branches, because these would go on the side of the ship like this, and then the sheeting would be attached to it. So it had to be very strong. So all of the trees belonged to the United States government. And so the revenue agent was there to collect the money for taking the U.S. tree. So people that were here were Miles Burnham, a couple of people that became governors and senators and so forth. They were, they brought their flutes and their violins, and we're happy here getting along. The problem was that when you raised something here, there was no way to get it to market. There were no inlets. Two of them were open, one in St. Lucie and one at Ponce Inlet. So there was no way to get products out. One thing happened. Turns out at Barker's Bluff, Sebastian, Mr. Barker was there with the revenue agent. It turns out that Mr. Barker had a little store, and a couple of Indians decided that they had been, these are renegade Indians, that they had been cheated. So they shoot the revenue agent, which alarmed the whole colony. So they all got on Captain Pinkerton's boat and went to St. Augustine. Now Miles Burnham's family left, but he wasn't there. He had taken a load of turtles to Savannah to sell them, green turtles, and they're difficult to transport, so he had little pillows made for their heads so they wouldn't bang their heads around on the trip. So he comes back to St. Augustine on his way home, finds his family there, and this place was deserted again. In 1856, the Army reported that there were 8 families in the 300 miles north of Fort Dallas, which was Miami. 300 miles, no people. No people. Well, nobody wanted to be counted anyway. This was the place to get away. I mean, if you were running away and you didn't want to be seen, you could find a spot here. The Civil War. At Jupiter Lighthouse and up at Canaveral, the lenses were taken off of the lighthouses and buried, so that the Yankee forces would have a hard time finding their way along the coast. There was a South Atlantic walking squadron of the U.S. Navy that was assigned to watch this whole coast, including the Indian River. Why? The blockade runners were coming from the Bahamas, Cuba, and so forth, and they were bringing in, arms, powder, medical supplies, some luxury items that people still had some money for. And those boats were unloaded in Melbourne, Rockledge, and then the materials were transferred over to the St. Johns River, which was the highway to the north. So while there were some people here at the time, they were not always the most honest people, but they were richer. One of those names was Henry Titus, and you probably recognize the name. He was pro-slavery. He'd been arrested for transporting men. He escaped a Confederate lockup somewhere. He was a blockade runner. And Sands Point, where he hung out, was really a hangout for criminals. I mean, this was anybody who was dealing in something they didn't want to talk about. You'd find them there. It's interesting, in 1860, there were 260 people counted in this area. By 1870, there were 1,216. So in that period, things began to happen. This is the steamboat time. So steamboats made regular trips up and down the Indian River Lagoon, and they stopped at Titusville, Rockledge, Melbourne, Sebastian, all the way down the whole Indian River Lagoon. So for the development of the time, this was I-95. You could come down the St. Johns River on a boat. You could get to Enterprise or just west of O'Galley. You'd go over on either a little train or an ox cart to Titusville or Melbourne, O'Galley, get on a steamboat and go down the Indian River. Now, during Reconstruction, it was a pretty interesting time, and someone you may have heard of, William Gleason. He was a Wisconsin carpetbagger who had been engaged in several questionable enterprises. One of them buying and selling goods during the Civil War in Washington, D.C. So he and his partner bought up land. Oh, he signed on with a Captain Thompson as a helper. I mean, the stories now say that he, was a contractor. He was a helper that went along to look at Florida because they were looking at Florida as a place to bring black slaves to reintroduce them and have their own place. So he and Thompson went around. They didn't go very far. They spent time in Miami, and then they wrote the report back that said, no, this is a terrible place to bring those poor slaves. And then they came down and bought up what's now Miami and O'Galley. The Homestead Act of 1866 was encouraging people to come here. But if you were a Confederate, you do not apply. Only for free men, and you had to have been loyal to the Union, and you could have 80 acres. It's really interesting because this was one of the places where you could homestead, but you didn't have to stay here all year because it was too hot. And so the homesteaders here would go to New England and work in the factories along the big rivers where the waterfalls were, and then come back here. But usually you have to spend 5 years and clear 5 acres and grow a crop. Gleason even tried to get the University of Florida here. He was lieutenant governor, and then as a scallywag, got, what do they call it, disbarred, or he wasn't lieutenant governor anymore. What happens then is that there's all these publications about this area. Most of the early ones are about hunting and fishing and the outdoor life and canoeing down the Indian River. Everybody here had a boat. There were no roads, but everyone knew everybody else's boat, and so all these books are describing what boat you had and who came and what fish you caught. And this is a beautiful book on the Indian River. He describes all the cities along, or cities at the time, along the Indian River Lagoon. I just like looking at the book. But there were all these reports. Then, I keep going there. Then what happens is the story then changes a little bit. Now it's not going out in the wild with all the guys and the guns, although you know, you could get on a steamboat here, and one of the entertainments was shooting birds as you went by. Hundreds, thousands of birds were shot. The bird that I felt bad about was the Carolina parakeet. It was a little green parakeet. They were all over the place here. And some of the old timers tell me that they shot them because if you hung your laundry out, these birds would come and poop on them. So, you know, there were people